26 years. That's how long I'd been the guy who made sure 380 supermarkets across 6 states got their cold chain product on time, on temp, and on shelf. Chicken, beef, seafood, dairy, produce, the stuff that goes bad if you blink wrong. I built that system from a clipboard and a CB radio in 1999 to a network of 14 distribution centers, 240 reefer trailers, and a routing logic that lived half on a server and half in my head. And on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, the new CEO's son-in-law walked into my office and told me my position had been right-sized effective Friday at 5. I want you to understand something before I tell this story. People hear supermarket logistics, and they yawn. They think it's trucks and warehouses and clipboards. They don't understand that the only reason you can walk into a Kroger on November 26th and find a 14-pound butterball sitting on ice is because somebody, somewhere, started solving that puzzle in August. The turkey on your Thanksgiving table is the end of a chain that started 90 days earlier with a forecast, a contract, a kill schedule, a freezer slot, a routing plan, a dock window, and about 400 phone calls. When that chain breaks, it doesn't break quietly. It breaks on the local news. It breaks with empty shelves and angry customers and a CEO who suddenly can't remember whose idea it was to fire the cold chain director 3 weeks before the biggest grocery holiday of the year. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter much for this story. Call me Hollis. I started at this company. I'll call it Meridian Foods, since the actual name's not the point. Back when the founder, an old Greek immigrant named Giannis, still walked the warehouse floor every Saturday morning in steel-toed boots. He hired me as a night dispatcher when I was 28, fresh off a divorce and a stint driving long haul. He saw something in me, I guess. Within 4 years, I was running the Atlanta D.C. By 2011, I was Director of Cold Chain Operations for the whole Southeast. By 2018, I was VP. 6 states, 380 stores, 42 million pounds of refrigerated product a week through our network. I knew every dock manager by his kid's name. I knew which carriers I could trust in an ice storm and which ones I had to babysit. I knew that the Pilot truck stop outside Macon had the best diesel price, but the worst exit ramp for a 53-footer in the rain. That kind of knowledge isn't in a textbook. It isn't in a PowerPoint. It lives in a man. Giannis died of a stroke in 2022. His daughter inherited the company. She'd been an executive at a soft drink conglomerate for 15 years and had ideas, as the saying goes. The first thing she did was bring in a McKinsey team. The second thing she did was bring in her son-in-law. His name was Tristan Voss, 29 years old, MBA from Tuck. He'd spent 2 years at a fintech startup that got acquired and 3 years at a supply chain consulting boutique in Boston, which, as far as I could tell, mostly built dashboards for people who already had dashboards. His title at Meridian was Chief Transformation Officer, which is what you call somebody when you don't actually have a job for him, but you have to put him on the org chart. The first time I met Tristan was in a glass conference room on the 4th floor of our headquarters in Charlotte. He shook my hand with both of his, which always tells you something. He told me he was energized by the opportunity to modernize legacy operations. I asked him what experience he had in cold chain. He smiled the way you smile at a child who's asked something cute and said, "Hollis, that's exactly the point. Fresh eyes." Fresh eyes. That's the phrase I want you to remember, because over the next 4 months, Tristan was going to use those fresh eyes to look right past every warning I gave him. It started small. He wanted access to our routing data. Fine, I gave it to him. He wanted to sit in on our weekly carrier calls. Fine. He sat there with his laptop open, nodding, typing. He brought in a consultant from his old firm, a woman about his age named Bryn, who built him a slide deck called Meridian 2.0, AI Native Cold Chain. It had a lot of hexagons in it. It had words like orchestration layer and predictive demand sensing and autonomous routing. It had a slide that said our current operation was running at 62% efficiency, a number he had pulled, I swear to God, out of his ass. I sat through that presentation in March. I tried to push back gently. I said, Tristan, the reason we hit 99.4% on time and full last quarter isn't because our software is brilliant. It's because we have human dispatchers who know that if Route 71 is icing over in the Smokies, you reroute the Knoxville load through Asheville before the carriers even call you. He nodded. He said, right, and imagine if the system could do that without the human. I said, it can't, because the system doesn't know that the Asheville DC's night manager retires in June and his replacement isn't ready yet, so we shouldn't add volume there until July. He said, we'll capture that in the metadata. Capture it in the metadata. That's the moment I knew. But I'm a professional. I spent a quarter century being a professional. So I kept my head down. I documented everything. I wrote a 46-page risk assessment in April that laid out, in plain English, every single way an AI-driven cold chain transformation could fail in a regulated, seasonal, perishable goods business. I emailed it to the CEO, to the CEOO, to the CO, to Tristan, and to legal. I asked for a meeting. I got a reply from Tristan's assistant that said the document had been received and routed for review. I never heard about it again. In June, Tristan announced, at a company town hall with confetti, I'm not exaggerating, that Meridian was partnering with an AI logistics platform called FluxRoute to fully autonomize our cold chain operations by Q1 of next year. The contract, I learned later, was worth $11.4 million over 3 years. Tristan had negotiated it personally. Bryn, his consultant friend, had moved to FluxRoute 6 weeks earlier as their VP of Customer Success. Nobody at Meridian seemed to find that particularly interesting. By August, Tristan had hired 3 AI implementation analysts, none of whom had ever set foot in a distribution center. They were good kids, I'll say that. Smart. Polite. One of them, a young woman named, I'll change her name to, Priya, came down to Charlotte to shadow me for a week. By Wednesday, she was nearly in tears. She said, Mr. Hollis, I don't understand half of what you do. There isn't a process document for any of it. I told her, kindly, that some things only live in the doing. She nodded and went back to her hotel, and I'm pretty sure she sent an email up the chain that night because the next morning Tristan called me and asked me to stop confusing the analysts. Stop confusing the analysts. 26 years of institutional knowledge, and I was confusing the analysts. That brings us to November. The fall produce surge had been ugly. Hurricane season had wrecked Florida tomatoes, and we'd had to scramble for Mexican supply, which meant rerouting half our southeast loads through Laredo. FluxRoute's system had been live-in shadow mode since September, meaning it was making recommendations alongside our human dispatchers but not actually controlling anything. It was wrong constantly. It recommended sending a load of strawberries on a 14-hour route in a non-vented reefer. It tried to schedule a turkey delivery into a store that had been closed for renovation since August. It kept assigning a carrier we'd blacklisted in 2021 for a temperature breach that cost us a recall. Every Friday, I'd send Tristan a summary of FluxRoute's errors that week. Every Friday, he'd reply, "Great data. This is how the model learns." Then came November 6th. A Wednesday. About 2:30 in the afternoon, my assistant, a woman named Marlene who'd been with me for 14 years, knocked on my office door and said Tristan and an HR rep were here to see me. I knew. The minute she said it, I knew. She knew too. I could see it in her face. Tristan came in with a thin manila folder. The HR woman, I'd seen her in the hallways, never spoken to her, sat down on the leather chair by the window and crossed her legs. Tristan sat across from me at my desk. He didn't make small talk. To his credit, he didn't pretend. He said, Hollis, as part of our transformation roadmap, we've made the difficult decision to eliminate the cold chain operations VP role effective this Friday, November 8th. The function will be absorbed into the FluxRoute Center of Excellence, which Priya Sundaram will be leading on an interim basis. I let that sit in the air for a second. Priya, the kid who'd been in tears in my office in August. I said, effective Friday. He said, effective Friday. I said, Tristan, you understand that Thanksgiving is in 20 days. He smiled. That same smile and said, Hollis. That same smile and said, Hollis, the Fluxroot system has been running in shadow mode for 9 weeks. We have full confidence in the cutover, and frankly, and I want you to hear this word for word because I will remember it until I die. Frankly, the holiday period is exactly the kind of high-volume environment where the AI's pattern recognition will outperform legacy human judgment. I looked at him. I said, Tristan, have you ever spent Thanksgiving Eve in a DC? He hadn't. Of course he hadn't, I said. I have. 23 of them. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, we move more turkey out of our Charlotte cold storage in 14 hours than we move in a normal week. The Atlanta DC alone runs 340 outbound loads in 3 days. The Birmingham yard has trucks stacked 4 deep, waiting for a dock. And every single one of those loads has a temperature spec, a delivery window, a store-level allocation, and a backup plan that lives in the heads of about 11 people who report to me. You're telling me a piece of software that's been wrong every Friday for 9 straight weeks is going to handle that? He said, and I'm not making this up, Hollis, I appreciate the passion, but this is exactly the kind of cultural resistance the transformation has to overcome. The HR woman slid a packet across the desk. Severance, 6 months, plus accrued vacation, plus a non-compete I'd have to sign to get it, plus an UNGA. There was a return of equipment checklist. There was a transition support letter offering me access to an outplacement service. Everything very professional. Everything very polished. I read every page. They sat there and watched me read it. It took about 20 minutes. When I was done, I looked up at Tristan and I said, Can I ask one question? He said, Of course. I said, Who's calling the carriers on Monday morning? He blinked. He said, I'm sorry? I said, The carriers. Werner, Schneider, Stevens, KLLM. The 8 regional reefer fleets we have annual contracts with. Who's calling them Monday morning to confirm the Thanksgiving surge schedule? Because that call happens every year, on the Monday 3 weeks out, between my office and theirs. 11 phone calls, about 4 hours of work. It's not in any system. It's a handshake call. Who's making those calls Monday? He looked at the HR woman. She looked at her packet. He said, Fluxroot has direct EDI connections with all our Tier 1 carriers. I said, EDI doesn't pick up the phone, Tristan. The carriers do the surge prioritization based on a verbal relationship that takes years to build. If nobody calls them Monday, we drop in their priority queue. By Wednesday morning, the trucks that were supposed to be ours are running for Publix or Wegmans or Food Lion. By Thursday, we're short capacity. By the following Tuesday, that's the 18th, we don't have enough reefer trailers to clear our turkey out of cold storage. He smiled again. Genuinely smiled, like I'd just confirmed something for him. He said, Hollis, this is exactly the kind of opaque knowledge transfer that's been holding the organization back. We'll handle it. Priya will reach out to the carriers. I nodded slowly. I said, okay. I said, I'd like Friday afternoon to clean out my office and do exit interviews with my direct reports. He said, of course, absolutely. I said, and I'd like to ask one favor, as a courtesy. 26 years. He said, anything within reason. I said, give me until Monday morning before you tell the carriers I'm gone. Don't send the announcement until 8 a.m. Monday. Let me say goodbye to my team in peace this weekend. After that, after Monday at 8, the announcement goes out and the system takes over. He said, of course, that's a very reasonable request. We'll hold the comms until Monday at 8. We shook hands. He left. The HR woman left. I sat in my office for a long time after they were gone, looking at the framed photograph on my wall of the Atlanta DC opening day, 2008. Yannis standing next to me in a hard hat, his arm around my shoulders. I took the photograph off the wall and put it in my briefcase. Everything else, I left. Now here's where I want you to pay attention, because what Tristan didn't understand, what Tristan couldn't understand with his Tuck MBA and his hexagons and his fresh eyes, is that I had spent 26 years building a network, and a network isn't a database. A network is people, people who owed me favors, people I'd helped through their own crises, people who'd called me at 2 in the morning when their dispatcher quit, or their refrigeration plant failed, or their CDL driver got pulled over with a hot load in Tennessee. I'd been there for them, every single time, for 26 years. When you spend 26 years being there for people in an industry, those people remember. I drove home that Wednesday evening with the radio off. I sat at my kitchen table with a bourbon and I made a list. Not a revenge list. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a vindictive man. I made a list of the people I needed to call before Monday morning because I was about to be unemployed. And because, in our industry, your reputation walks out the door with you, and the only thing that pays your mortgage in the long run is who picks up the phone when you call. I called my wife first. She knew before I finished the second sentence. She said, "How long do we have?" I said, 6 months severance, but I'll have a consulting practice up by January. She said, "Good, I'll make a pot roast Sunday." That's a marriage, by the way. 31 years of it. We don't waste words. Thursday morning, I drove to the office at 6 a.m. I told Marlene what had happened. She cried. I told her she'd be fine. Priya would need her, even if Priya didn't know it yet. And Marlene's institutional knowledge was protected for 90 days under the new org structure. Then I closed my office door, and I started making calls. I didn't sabotage anything. I want that to be clear. I didn't delete files. I didn't poach customers. I didn't violate my non-compete, which I hadn't signed yet anyway. I made personal phone calls to friends in the industry, on my personal cell phone, from my personal office, on my own time, between meetings I no longer needed to attend. Call 1 was to a man named, I'll call him Buck, who ran dispatch for one of our biggest reefer carriers. Buck and I had known each other since 2004. I told him I was moving on from Meridian, effective Friday. He was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "Hollis, tell me they're not going to try to run the Thanksgiving surge on that flux route thing." I said, "Buck, I can't speak to my former employer's operational decisions." He said, "Jesus Christ." I said, "I'm going to be doing some independent consulting starting in January. Cold chain advisory. If you ever need an extra set of eyes on something complex, surge planning, peril routing, that kind of thing, call me." He said, "I'll call you Monday." Call 2 was to a woman named, I'll call her Donna, who'd been the VP of supply chain at one of our biggest customer chains, a regional grocer with 180 stores in our footprint. Donna and I had pulled 3 major disasters out of the fire together over the years. I told her the news. She was furious on my behalf for about 90 seconds. Then she got quiet and asked the same question Buck had. Was Meridian planning to ride the AI system through Thanksgiving? I said I really couldn't comment. She said, "Hollis, my CEO is going to want to know about this. We have $46 million in turkey, ham, and prime rib coming through your network in the next 18 days. I said, "Donna, you should ask your account manager at Meridian about contingency plans. That's not my place anymore." She said, "I'll have my CEO call their CEO this afternoon." Call 3 through 11 were similar. Carriers, customers, 2 former dispatch managers who'd moved to competitors, a guy at the USDA regional office who'd been at our table at the industry banquet 4 years running. I didn't tell anyone to do anything. I just told them I was moving on. They drew their own conclusions. That's what professionals do. By Thursday evening, my phone had rung 18 times with people calling me back. By Friday morning, 3 of my biggest customers had called Meridian's CEO directly asking for assurances about the Thanksgiving surge. I packed my office Friday afternoon. Marlene helped. We didn't say much. I shook hands with my direct reports, 6 of them, every one of them tearing up, and I told them to do their best for Priya, who was a good kid and over her head. I told them that if any of them needed a reference, ever, my cell number was the same as it had ever been. Then I walked out the front doors at 4:47 p.m. on Friday, November 8th, with a cardboard box under my arm, and I drove home and ate a pot roast with my wife. Monday morning, 8:04 a.m., Meridian's internal announcement went out, just like Tristan had promised. By 8006, my phone was ringing. By 9:30, I had taken 9 calls. By noon, I had taken 22. 2 of them were from Meridian's CEO's office, which I let go to voicemail. The carrier calls happened, or didn't happen, that morning. Priya, bless her heart, did try to make them. I heard about it later. She called Werner first, got transferred 3 times, finally reached a regional dispatch manager who didn't know her and who was sitting on his own surge prioritization meeting that started at 10. He told her he'd get back to her by end of week. She called Snyder. Same result. She called Snyder. Same result. She called KLM. Same. By Tuesday, none of the carriers had committed surge capacity to Meridian. By Wednesday, the 12th, they'd allocated that capacity to other regional grocers. By Thursday, FluxRoute's autonomous routing system was generating loads that had no trucks assigned to them. The system didn't know that. It just kept generating loads. I want to describe what happened the following week because this is where Tristan's hexagons met reality. Monday the 17th, 3 days before the Thanksgiving surge was supposed to peak, Meridian's Charlotte cold storage was at 94% capacity. Frozen turkeys, mostly. Some hams. A lot of pre-orders for the customer chains. Outbound trucks were supposed to start moving them on Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. By Monday at noon, the FluxRoute dashboard showed 167 outbound loads scheduled for Tuesday and 31 confirmed carriers. The other 136 loads had been auto-assigned to carriers who had never agreed to the assignment, because the system was pulling from old contract data and didn't know that the surge negotiations had never happened. Priya figured this out around 3 p.m. Monday and called Tristan. Tristan called the CEO. The CEO called an emergency leadership meeting at 5 p.m. that lasted 4 hours. Around 9 p.m. Monday, the CEO's chief of staff called me at home. I let it ring. She called again at 9:30. I picked up. She said, "Hollis, we need you back. Tomorrow morning. Any terms." I want you to understand what I felt in that moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I'm being honest with you. I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt like a man who'd warned a child not to touch a hot stove and was now watching the child cry. The 380 stores out there waiting for their turkey weren't Tristan. They were customers, real families, real Thanksgivings. The truckers in those reefer cabs had families too. The warehouse hands at our DCs, most of them I'd hired myself, were going to work 14-hour shifts that week, regardless of what happened in the C-suite. I said, "I'll come back, on 3 conditions." She said, "Anything." I said, "First, I come back as an independent consultant, not as an employee. My rate is $600 an hour, with a 60-day minimum at 40 hours a week guaranteed. That's $144,000, paid in advance by Wednesday morning, before I take a single call." She didn't even hesitate. She said, "Done." I said, "Second, the FluxRoute contract is suspended for 60 days, not canceled. I'm not telling your CEO how to run her vendor relationships, but suspended. The human dispatch team reports to me directly during my engagement, and Priya reports to me, not to Tristan. Tristan has no operational involvement in cold chain during my engagement. 0. He doesn't sit in on meetings. He doesn't get CC'd on emails. He's invisible to my operation." She said, "Done." I said, "Third, I want a clean conscience. I'm not coming back to clean up a mess and then get sandbagged when it's over. I want a letter signed by the CEO on company letterhead stating that my termination was reversed, that there were no grounds for it, and that the non-compete and NDA are voided. And I want it before I walk in the building Tuesday morning." She said, "I'll have it on your kitchen table by 7 a.m. It was on my kitchen table by 6:48 a.m. I drove into Meridian Tuesday morning, November 18th at 7:30. Marlene met me at the front door with coffee and cried again. I went up to the 4th floor. The CEO was waiting in the big conference room with her COO and her chief of staff. Tristan was not there. I want you to picture this. 26 years I'd worked in that building, and the woman whose father had hired me stood up when I walked in and said, "Thank you for coming back, Hollis. I owe you an apology." I said, "Ma'am, I don't need an apology. I need a phone." I started making calls at 7:52 a.m. I called Buck first. I said, "Buck, it's Hollis. I'm back at Meridian on a consulting basis. I need you, personally, to look me in the eye through this phone and tell me you can find me 40 extra reefer trailers between Charlotte and Atlanta by Thursday morning." Buck said, "Hollis, for you, I can find you 50, but it's gonna cost." I said, "I know it's gonna cost. I'm authorized. Send me the surge premium contract by 10 a.m. and I'll have it signed by noon." He said, "Welcome back, brother." I made 18 more calls like that one before lunch. By Tuesday evening, we had clawed back 84% of our surge capacity. By Wednesday afternoon, we were at 97%. We lost about $1.4 million in surge premiums we wouldn't have paid if Tristan hadn't fired me. We lost about $600,000 in spoilage from product that had sat in cold storage 2 days too long. We lost 2 customer accounts permanently. A regional chain in Tennessee who'd been so spooked by the near miss that they signed a contract with our competitor on November 19th, and a smaller chain in Alabama who never quite forgave us. Total damage to Meridian, by my back-of-the-envelope estimate, was somewhere around $8.2 million in direct costs and lost future business. Tristan's transformation had been pitched as saving the company $3.4 million a year. The Thanksgiving surge ran. The turkeys got to the stores. The 380 customers we served had full shelves on the morning of November 26th. Nobody outside of about 40 people in our industry ever knew how close it had come to a catastrophic failure. I worked 80-hour weeks for 60 straight days. I billed every hour. In late January, with the dust settled, the CEO offered me my old job back, permanent, with a raise. I told her I'd think about it. I called my wife. We talked it over. The next morning, I told the CEO no. I said I'd be available on retainer for $400 an hour, 20-hour-a-week minimum, 6-month renewable contract, working from my home office in Mooresville. She accepted on the spot. Tristan, I should mention, was reassigned to a strategic initiatives role in March. He resigned in May to join a venture capital firm focused on, and I'm quoting his LinkedIn here, AI-native supply chain disruption. Bryn, his consultant friend at Fluxroot, was let go in April when Fluxroot lost 3 other grocery clients in the wake of what people in the industry started calling, only half-jokingly, the Meridian incident. My consulting practice is now in its 2nd year. I have 11 clients. I bill out at $725 an hour now. I work about 30 hours a week. My wife and I bought a cabin on Lake James last summer. My daughter, the older one, the lawyer, gave us our first grandbaby in September. I drove down to Atlanta last month to speak at a logistics industry conference. The title of my talk was Things AI Can't Learn. It was standing room only. I'll tell you what I think about most, though. It's not the money. It's not Tristan. It's not even the satisfaction, which I'll admit I did feel, of being right. What I think about most is Giannis, the old Greek man who hired me in 1999. He used to say something in that thick accent of his when he'd walk the warehouse on Saturday mornings. He'd point at the dock workers and the drivers and the dispatchers and he'd say, "Hollis, the business is not the trucks, the business is not the boxes. The business is the people who know how the trucks and the boxes work. You forget that, you lose everything." His daughter forgot. For about 3 weeks in November, she forgot, and it cost her $8 million and a piece of her father's legacy. But she remembered in the end. That's worth something. And me, I remember every day, every time my phone rings at 6 in the morning and it's Buck or Donna or some dispatcher I trained 20 years ago, calling because something's going sideways and they need somebody who knows where the bodies are buried. I pick up, I always pick up, because Giannis was right. The business is the people. You can't capture that in the metadata. I've thought about that November a lot in the years since, not because of the money, and not because of Tristan. Though I won't pretend I never replayed the moment he smiled at me across my own desk and called 26 years of phone calls opaque knowledge transfer. I've thought about it because of how clearly it laid out a rule I'd only half understood before. Every consequence in that story had a cause, and every cause was a choice somebody made. Tristan chose to mistake a job title for an education. The CEO chose to trust a son-in-law over a track record. Giannis's daughter chose, for 3 weeks in November, to forget what her own father had taught her. And me, I chose, on a Wednesday afternoon in my office with a manila folder in front of me, to keep my dignity, keep my word, and trust that the people I'd shown up for over 26 years would show up for me when the bill came due. Causes and effects. Nothing mystical about it. What I want to pass on, especially to the younger folks who write me emails after my conference talks, is that the 3 things that carried me through that mess weren't luck. The first is plain decency. I didn't sabotage anything when I walked out that door. I didn't delete a file. I didn't poach a customer. I didn't badmouth Tristan to a single soul in the industry. I just kept my hands clean. And when the phone rang, my conscience was clear enough to answer it. The second is what I'd call practical wisdom. Not the kind you get in a classroom, but the kind you earn by paying attention. Knowing which dispatcher at Werner takes his coffee black and which one's daughter just started at Auburn. Knowing that an EDI connection isn't a relationship. That kind of knowing only comes from caring enough to remember. The third is the hardest, and it's the one I'd want my grandkids to understand. It's the steadiness to sit still when the storm hits. When Tristan fired me, I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't even argue past the point of being heard. I went home, I had a bourbon, I made a list, and I went to work the next morning like a professional. Grit isn't drama. Grit is doing the next right thing on a Thursday when you've been kicked in the teeth on a Wednesday. I think the world keeps trying to convince us that there's a shortcut, a software, a hexagon, a fresh pair of eyes. Maybe sometimes there is. But for the things that really matter, the people, the trust, the long, slow accumulation of being where you said you'd be, there isn't. There's just showing up, day after day after day, until one Monday morning the phone rings, and somebody on the other end says your name like it means something. That's the whole lesson. That's all I've got.